On a day like today, it's hard to imagine that winter was even here. It's so warm. It's spring. And it's also hard to imagine that winter will be back. But winter will be back. And there was actually a time when winter decided to stick around. Well, there exists in the world a valley. On either side of the valley, there are tall, steep mountains. And these mountains have evergreen trees on them. They have hardwood trees, deciduous trees, and they're quite beautiful. And down in the center of this valley, way down in the center, lies a river. And this river runs all the way through the valley, tumbling over rocks, cascading over waterfalls, and eventually settling out to a low floodplain where the land opens up between the mountains, and there lies a village. Now the people in this village live off of the river. They fish there, they play there, they swim there, and they let the waterfalls lighten their spirits. They also farm in the floodplains. Late one autumn, winter returned to this valley. And winter did exactly what winter always does. With a brush of his arms, the landscape was covered with snow. And from his breath came the cold winds from the north. And he shook ice out onto the waters, creating beautiful patterns. One day, winter decided to explore the valley a little more and to admire his handiwork. As winter was strolling around the forests and up on the mountains and in the peaks and down into the valleys and freezing the little rivulets of water that ran off the mountains, he recognized that this was a place that he really, really liked. See, winter was pretty tired. Winter had been traveling all across the world over and over and over again. And everywhere he went, he brought the cold, he brought the snow, he brought the frost. And he was beginning to slow down. He had been looking for a place to call his home and was ready to retire. And here, in this valley, he found it. He thought, my, this is such a beautiful place. I want to stay. As he wandered through the forest, he eventually came out into a little clearing, and there in the clearing was sitting a young girl. She was wrapped up in her warmest coat. She had gloves, a hat, and warm boots on, sitting there in the snow. Of course, winter looks very, very different from a person. Winter's cloak is made of snow. And when he speaks, snowflakes erupt from his voice. And there, on his face, is a long white beard made of ice. Winter leaned over and said, "Hello." The little girl moved back, a little frightened, and asked, "Well, who are you?" And Winter replied, "Well, I'm Winter. I come every year. I make the lands cold, and I bring the snows and the winds and the ice." Then Winter began to explain how beautiful this valley was to the girl. And Winter went on and on and on about all of the things he'd seen there, and all of the things that were so special about this valley in particular. He'd traveled the world. He'd seen many beautiful places. And he said he was getting tired. And he told her that he decided to stay. And he told her of his plans to live high up in the mountains. Well, the little girl was quite smart and quite keen. she recognized that if winter were to stay all the time, well, that means there'd be no spring. And that means there'd be no summer. And of course, she knew that her and her village and her community, her family and friends, all needed to fish. And if the rivers were frozen, they wouldn't be able to fish for food. She also knew that if the ground was frozen and too cold to grow crops, that they wouldn't be able to farm. This, of course, seemed like a really bad idea for her and her community. And the young girl said, I want to make a deal with you. I would like you to move on after you've heard 3 flowers sing to you. And Winter leaned back. Well, that's kind of silly, because I've covered the earth in this valley with snow. Now, the girl, she knew the land really well. She spent all of her time out in the woods and along the rivers and in the marshes, and she knew the plants and animals super well. She said, yes, Winter, when you hear 3 flowers singing to you, you have to move on. Winter chuckled and said, of course. I agree. When I hear 3 flowers singing to me, I will move on. And there, Winter walked off into the forest laughing and turning the trees to ice, because he thought he would be able to stay in this valley forever. Well, the next day, when Winter strolled from his mountaintop peak down into the valley, he heard a noise far off in the forest that sounded like "Rrrp, rrrp." And he didn't pay too much mind to it. He kept on walking freezing puddles, turning water into ice, and admiring his fine work, fine craftsmanship. And as he walked, he heard it again. "Rrrp, rrrp." He walked towards where the noise was, and there, erupting from the snow, were several small plants. They each had a white flower drooping from a stalk, and they were still and tiny. And Winter noticed they were coming up through the snow, and he thought, well, this can't be. This isn't right. I've never seen flowers come up through the snow. And he heard the noise again. "Rrrp, rrrp." Winter heard the flower singing, and quickly turned away from the flower and kept walking, his mind racing, never having heard a flower sing to him. Now, Winter didn't see it, but behind a tree next to these small flowers called snowdrops was a wood frog. The wood frog is one of the earliest frogs to come out and sing. And the snowdrop is one of the earliest flowers to erupt through the snow. Now, Winter returned back to his winter peak high up in the mountains, and the next day returned down to the valley and continued walking, exploring, admiring his work, thinking of how wonderful a life in this valley would be forever. He could relax, he could create, and he could keep the valley frozen and in snow. As he walked, he saw a very, very tiny flower in a patch of leaves growing up from next to a boulder. This flower had several petals, white petals, with pink lines running through it. It was Spring Beauty, another one of the earliest flowers to arrive in the forests. As he stooped down to look at the flower, to admire its beauty, he heard a peeping noise, psst, 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 very loud, coming from behind the flower. He jumped back. He thought the flower was singing to him. He didn't notice that behind the flower was a spring peeper. A tiny, tiny, tiny spring peeper. They're so small you can barely see them, but they have some of the loudest calls. Of course, Winter became really concerned. He thought he was going crazy. He shook his beard and icicles flew everywhere. "I can't believe this," said Winter. "I'm returning to the mountain to think." And there he strode up into the forest to sit in quiet and think about these singing flowers. Now, the girl had been following Winter this whole time, and she watched him move through the forest, admiring his work and creating icy sculptures. And the sun was getting stronger. Even still, Winter persisted and continued to blanket the earth with snow. The girl knew the forest so well. She knew that when these flowers were coming up, that these frogs would also be singing. And as Winter strolled through the forest, confident that there could be no more singing flowers in this forest, he heard a noise. Winter looked around. My goodness. There, in front of Winter, was a tiny yellow flower. This flower was hanging from a stem just like this, and its petals were flexed back, 6 of them in fact. And they had green leaves, only 2 of them, with purple splotches on them. It was trout lily. Winter thought he was going crazy. Surely this flower is not singing to me. And as he walked towards the flower, he heard the noise again. Winter didn't see the gray tree frog hiding up in the branches above the flower. Gray tree frogs are so camouflaged. He had no idea it was there. Winter's eyes got really big, and he slowly stepped back. And as he was moving away from the flower, he turned, and there was the girl, smiling. And she said, "Winter, have you heard? Have you heard the early flowers singing? Have you heard the spring ephemeral flowers singing?" Of course the girl knew that Winter had seen these flowers and heard the frogs singing, for she's been following Winter through the forest. Winter became cold and blustery and windy and snowy, and icicles flew out of his beard. And he looked at the girl and said, "What is your name?" "My name's Trillium," she said. "And what if I don't go?" And Trillium said, "Well, then I will have to sing, and my song is stronger than your winter." Winter, having seen these flowers singing, thought that perhaps this young girl had magical powers, and decided to honor their agreement and move on. And every year, Winter returns in the late autumn to the mountains. And every year, Winter leaves when the first flowers begin to sing.